fall deaths when jumping out of a plane. You know, there is an absence of RCTs on that, but you know, I don't think anyone would argue that that absence of evidence is evidence of absence. Like parachutes clearly work. But imagine an alternate world where there were 30 RCTs on the efficacy of wearing a parachute when you jump out of a plane for preventing fall deaths. And let's just say parachutes don't work. So you run those RCTs
on and once and for all solve this very specific question, right? Mm-hmm. But it's along the same lines where we're like, so if this is true, there's a lot of resistance training research, and there are many areas in which this should be starting to, this effect, if real and meaningful, should be starting to reveal itself to us in some of these related and indirect ways. We should be getting glimpses of it, hints of it. And when I look at the user level pushback, so people who are not fitness professionals, they don't make fitness content, but they're just like, hey, you know, I tried reverse dieting and I thought it actually worked better than you're representing here. So far, 100% of those, when they describe their experience, I can just kind of point them to illusions 1 through 4. One of them will apply to their situation. Mm-hmm. So far that's been the case where I just say, yeah, that sounds a lot like illusion number 3, and that's kind of the end of it. In terms of professional level pushback, again, I've just kind of been a little bit underwhelmed in the sense that the critical feedback has lacked a lot of substance. It hasn't really said, oh, claims with research, I'm going to look at other research. I get a number of questions from people that were all kind of in the same general genre. And it's because I definitely presented an idea without fully clarifying what I was getting at. You know, so I definitely take the L on that one. I should have explained this with a lot more clarity. Mm-hmm. So I talked a little bit about preferential fat regain after weight loss. And so a lot of people have said, okay, well, if that's the case, like, are you just totally screwed if you do a cut and eventually want to bulk in the future? You know, so if you're trying to bulk from a body weight or a body fat level that is lower than your previous maximum, does that mean that you're just going to fail and it's going to be fat rather than lean mass? And it's a related question is people say, well, we have to remember that the success of a bulking phase is going to be dictated very heavily by whether or not you have a sufficient stimulus for substantial hypertrophy, right? And then whether or not you have created conditions that are permissive of hypertrophy. So when we talk about, you know, a really muscular physique athlete who is absolutely shredded, their post-diet experience in that immediate post-diet phase, it's unlikely that they're going to be doing a lot of hypertrophy because they're probably somewhat close to their genetic limit in some cases, you know, so they don't have kilograms of muscle tissue to add or something that is more in terms of how high you go with your calories, right? So if you are doing this bulking phase and you are doing a really good job of matching your caloric intake to the actual true energy cost of the hypertrophy that you're stimulating, you know, so you're not way overshooting it. If you're able to match that up really well, I see no reason why you shouldn't be able to have a really successful bulking phase after a cut if you're not inviting, you know, precipitous fat gain in the process. But the question is, when you go over, what happens, right? So when we look at the overfeeding literature, we can see that when people are overfeeding from a kind of typical natural body weight, for a lot of people, there's a little bit of a cushion there where total daily energy expenditure will ramp up adaptively to kind of offset overfeeding. Mm-hmm. And that it differs a lot from person to person. Some people don't have much capacity for that. But at a neutral body weight, for a lot of people, if they're bulking from a natural body weight and they overshoot a little bit, they might offset some of that overshooting with their by some adjustments in energy expenditure. But what I argue is based on the preferential fat regain that we observe in these studies, it's exceedingly unlikely that you're going to have that same buffer, that same margin of error after a weight loss diet. So what I'm arguing here is you absolutely can go straight from a cut into a successful lean bulking phase.
They're super shredded, and their body just really wants to regain fat because it's not healthy to be that.
Right, yeah. And I think this is kind of a glaring example of one of the biggest conceptual issues I have with reverse dieting, which is that if you ever read someone's content promoting it, you know, if it's you know, an article, the first section, or if it's a book, the first chapter often says, hey, when you diet, metabolic adaptation happens, all these physiological changes happen. The post-diet period is a very, very unique physiological state that has to be approached strategically. And then when they get to the chapter where they say reverse dieting works, they're basing it entirely on overfeeding studies in people who are not in that physiological state. Mm-hmm. So like the entire setup for the problem, the entire premise, they say this is a very unique state that has to be navigated very strategically, and then literally the evidence they're using is like, so let's assume that this isn't a unique physiological state.
Yeah, yeah.
Why?
That's a good question.
All right, not a question for you. I'm not going to hold your feet to the fire. One other thing I wanted to mention, I saw this on your Twitter, I think, an incredible feat of strength. You should be the one to present this since you found it.
Yeah, sure. So Jamal Browner, who is a 110 kilo or 242 pound competitor in powerlifting, recently pulled 500 kilos in training. That is 1,100.
Yeah. All right. So I think we're clear to dive into the content, and your segment is up first. So what do you got for us?
Yeah. So I am talking about the extent to which gains in muscle mass and strength differ between individuals, and just fitness in general, increases in fitness level. I'm going to talk about variability in gains in aerobic fitness as well. But yeah, like I wanted to talk about this because I think people often severely underestimate the extent to which gains in muscle, strength, general fitness level, understand the sorts of variability you should expect to see in training responses. And then also, towards the end of this segment, I'm going to talk about if you are someone who responds to training worse than the typical person, like, you know, I would anticipate that this probably applies to about 50% of folks in the audience, give or take. Some things that you can potentially do about that to either make better gains or to maybe find a bit more contentment in the gains that you do see.
Cool.
Yeah. So first off, to start with, the thing that kind of got me, authors or the researchers did a cluster analysis where they basically looked to see they split out the people who basically had like 25th to 75th percentile type gains, the people in the bottom quartile and people in the top quartile, looking at gains in fiber cross-sectional area just to see how, you know, results differ between individuals. And so in this study, after everyone went through the exact same training program for 16 weeks, the bottom quartile of responses, on average, these people, their quad fibers did not increase in cross-sectional area at all, on average. Like the mean change was 0 square miles.
Kind of cluster around numbers, because it's like the lower
I love it when
responders.
numbers cluster around numbers.
Well, yeah, that was an eloquent way of saying it. But let me try to explain that more. So like the approximate average for the lower response group was like 0.
Yeah.
And then they were nice round numbers. So like the middle responder groups, it was like 1,000. So it's like 0 hypertrophy units or 1, and then up around 2,000. You know, a nice doubling is where you get the kind of high response groups, and then up around 3,000, like a tripling of the average, approximately.
Yeah.
Is where you get the basically like the real outlier, right?
Yeah.
Like the person that you see on Instagram, and you're like, there's no way they're that, right?
Well, and I mean, I would even push back against that because this study has 16 subjects. Like, that's not the sort of sample you need to find true outliers.
Well, yeah,
Like
within this game.
As you pointed out out with the prior study, like the best response was about 3 times the average response. And that's more or less what we see here. Like the average response was gains of 15–20%. The best responses were like 50–60%. So about 3 times better than average. And then also the study assessed changes in maximum voluntary contraction strength of the biceps, so just elbow flexion in VCs. And you see a pretty normal distribution here as well, with most people experiencing gains in elbow flexion strength of around 20%, so that was approximately the average, with a handful of people experiencing small decreases, a handful of people experiencing increases in the 70–90% range, and one subject experiencing an increase of a classic study, the Heritage study from, I think it started in maybe the late 80s through the 90s. And this, the Heritage study itself is really cool. If you're someone who's interested in aerobic training in general, heritability of trainability and general fitness characteristics, the Heritage study was a huge trial, absolute classic, definitely worth looking into. But the particular paper resulting from that study that I'm going to talk about here, title was Familial Aggregation of VO2 Max Response to Exercise Training, results from the Heritage study from Bouchard and colleagues in 1999. And this study, very similar to the cue ball study, big sample size, 481 total subject variability we see in strength gains after a resistance training program. The reason we were interested in this is the studies by Barbalio and colleagues reported very, very low variability in strength gains. Like, you know, if a training program added 20 kilos to people's squats on average, they might report like 20 plus or minus 2 kilos. Like basically everyone gained between 15 and 25 kilos without much variability, which seemed pretty low. So we had an archive of like 83 studies that I had looked into for just like various meta-analysis projects previously. So it was an unbiased sample that we weren't just cherry picking for the purposes of this particular investigation, where we could basically look and see like, hey, in the literature as a whole, in a pretty large group of studies, what is the typical variability we see in strength gains? And that was quantified in terms of what's called a Cohen's VZ value, which all that is average gains in a particular strength measure divided by the standard deviation for those seem like extreme responses, but we're staying within 2 standard deviations of the mean here.
Yeah.
That's just perfectly normal stuff that you would observe all the time. And then just in terms of not so much gains in strength, gains in muscle, gains in aerobic fitness, but just kind of like real world data on how strong people actually are. So back in 2015, I sent out a survey to the Stronger by Science audience, asking, you know, basically training pretty hard for either powerlifting specifically or like powerlifting style training. Fill out this survey. There were a lot of things in the survey, but one of the things I asked about, or 2 of the things I asked about were, how long have you been training and what is your 1 rep max squat, bench, and deadlift? And I want to talk about this, just variability in terms of how strong people actually are relative to how long they've been training, because I think that there's an unfortunate facet of the strength training content landscape is the comments with, I will note, a biased sample. Like, so I'm not saying that this is how strong the average person gets when after they've been training for X period of time. Like, these are people who are training with the express intent of trying to get as strong as possible in squat, bench, and deadlift. So, you know, this probably won't generalize to the typical gym you go to, unless you happen to train at a powerlifting gym. But just to give some examples here, after 6 to 12 months of training, the typical male, or for like the average 1 rep max squat strength for a male lifter in this survey was about 150 kilos, which makes sense. You know, from spending a lot of time coaching powerlifters, training in powerlifting gyms, if a new lifter comes in and they devote themselves to lifting pretty hard, you know, 3 plate squat within a year, like that's a very realistic thing that you see all the time. But yeah, the average was like 150 kilos, which is 330 pounds, but the standard deviation was like 35 kilos. So when you go plus or minus 2 standard deviations from the mean, the bottom end of that range is 176 pounds, about 80 kilos. And the top end of that range is about 220 kilos, or about 485 pounds. So, you know, we're not, again, even talking about outliers here, but some are talking about plus or minus 2 standard deviations from the mean, which is where most people fall. And so, if you're concerned, like, hey, I seem to be experiencing smaller strength gains than most people, am I atypical? Is something wrong? Probably not. Like, you probably fall within this sort of range I'm talking about. There's a very, very good probability that you do. So the next question here is why? Why do we see this amount of variability in responses to training, resistance training, aerobic training, etc.? And it's hard to say for methodological reasons, but one of the contributors almost assuredly is just genetics. Like, some people, like, they just got a better genetic draw for training than other people did. Like, if you look at professional athletes in just about any sport, they pick better parents for their sport than you did, and that's why they're a pro and you're not. But it's hard to say, it's hard to put a super precise estimate on exactly the extent to which genetics per se influence these things. And this is beyond the scope of this segment, but I am somewhat skeptical of like super precise estimates of heritability, just because of like the methodology of how those studies work. And like I said, that's too big of a rabbit hole to go down. Like the way that you would typically try to estimate the heritability matter, and then specifically for hypertrophy, there are a lot of little things that we know to be predictive, at least in some circumstances, of how well people will respond to a hypertrophy stimulus. And citations for all of these will be in the show notes, but for example, satellite cell and myonuclei responses seem to be predictive of hypertrophy responses. So people who have larger elevations in satellite cell content and greater myonuclear accretion following training tend to experience more hypertrophy than those who don't. Particular microRNA responses seem to be predictive of training responses. That's from a 2014, I believe, study by Davidson and colleagues. Ribosome biogenesis seems to be predictive, which that makes a lot of intuitive sense. If you think back to high school biology, ribosomes are the actual little like cellular machines that build the proteins, and so that's kind of like a precondition for being able to build a lot of additional new contractile protein in your muscles. So if 2 people undergo the same training stimulus and one of them only has a small elevation in ribosome content in their muscles and one of them has a large elevation in ribosome content in their muscles, who knows why those ribosome responses differ, but if they do, the one who winds up with more ribosomes will just have more little cellular machines that are capable of building those proteins that their DNA is asking them to build. Particularly responses predictive of gains in hypertrophy, and androgen receptor density. Although androgen levels themselves say that on the day that the post-training assessment occurred, it just wasn't your day. You had a shitty night of sleep the night before, like maybe your shoulder feels tight for no apparent reason, you just slept on it funny, your girlfriend or boyfriend just broke up with you. Like, you don't feel good when you walk into the lab, you test your bench press strength, and it's just just not a good day in the gym and he hit 180. So, you know, the result from that study would suggest your bench press strength went down 5 pounds, but in real terms it actually went up 5 pounds, and you just had a bad day of testing. So some of the variability we see in responses to training are almost assuredly due to stuff like that, just basic measurement error or day-to-day fluctuations in strength or general performance. But, like, I want to make this very clear, the magnitude of different responses we see between people are way larger than could be attributed to just technical measurement error or day-to-day fluctuations in strength. Like, if one person is experiencing a 5 kilo decrease in squat strength, and one person experiences a 50 kilo increase in squat strength, those two people didn't experience the same strength gains and just had a good or bad day of testing pre or post. Like those are true, like very quantifiable differences between people. But I did just want to make that note because, you know, when you're talking about any of this stuff, like it's important to keep stuff like measurement error or just day-to-day fluctuations in mind. But those factors like that, the sheer magnitude of variation we see.